Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Abby and I'm the maker and designer behind So Homey. And today I have behind me the Knot Knot shelf. It's a crochet pattern that was inspired by macrame wall hangings with an added shelf detail. I really challenged myself to translate the beautiful texture and geometry that you get from macrame into a crochet piece. And I hope that you love it just as much as I do and that you will follow along to this tutorial and create your very own Knot Knot shelf. If you follow the links in the description below, it will take you to the pattern on my website, Etsy, or Ravelry, and from there you can download the pattern. But I will also be walking you through the pattern step by step in this video. It's quite fun and simple to catch on. I got some great feedback from my testers and they did a fantastic job. I just had to add their photos to this video to show them off. This wall hanging is worked bottom up and it uses a combination of front post stitches and front post two together stitches. And then the fringe and the shelf are added at the end. The yarn that I will be using for this tutorial is called Peaches and Cream. It's a 100% cotton blend yarn. It's worsted weight and these balls come in 120 yards and the colorway I'm using is Ecru. You can also substitute this yarn for another 100% worsted weight cotton yarn. To get started with the pattern, we want to use the larger of the two hook sizes, which is the 5.5mm crochet hook, and we'll only be using this one for the chain row. Then we will switch to the 5mm crochet hook for the duration of the project. But for now, we're going to use the 5.5mm crochet hook to make a chain of 63 stitches. And you want to use a larger crochet hook for the chain row because this is going to set up row number 1 to work into those back bumps much easier. But if you don't have a larger hook size and you only have the 5mm crochet hook, that won't be a problem. Just be sure to work your chains a lot looser than you typically would. So this is what our chain row is looking like now, but since we're done chaining 63, I'm going to lose the 5.5mm crochet hook and swap it for my 5mm crochet hook. And then we're ready to start row number 1. So we're going to be working row number 1 into the back bumps of the chain stitches, and we're going to be single crocheting into every single stitch. So we will end up with 63 single crochets by the end of this. So we don't skip any. We're going to work into that very first back bump here. And you can see that back bump is like right there. What I like to do, the first one is honestly the hardest because you'll try to pull this yarn and it makes it very tight. So loosen up that yarn a bit on your crochet hook. Insert your crochet hook into that back bump. I like to use my thumb to help. And then you can go ahead and tighten up that yarn so that it's on the crochet hook. So now you have the 2 loops on your crochet hook. We're going to yarn over, pull through that back bump stitch, then you still have 2 loops. Then you're going to yarn over and pull through both of those loops, and that's how you get your single crochet into that back bump. Now we're going to move on to the next stitch, and you can see right here is that back bump. So I insert my crochet hook into the back bump. I yarn over, pull it through that back bump stitch. We have 2 loops on the crochet hook. We yarn over and then pull through both of those stitches. And that's our second back bump stitch. Then we're just going to continue this technique of working into the back bumps for the remainder of row number 1 so that until we get the 63 stitches worked. I have a few stitches worked now and I want to show you why we work into the back bumps. I just love sharing about this technique. There's even a video linked if you're interested. This is the top of row number 1 and you can see the V's that represent the stitches. And then this is the right side of row 1. But if we look at this from the bottom, this is what the chain row looks like. It's very similar to the top of row 1 because when you crochet into the back bumps, it forces the V's or the tops of the stitches to the bottom. And this gives you a nice and clean edge, but it's important for this particular project because we add the French to the wall hanging at the bottom. And I'll show you what this looks like later on in the video. When our stitches look like this, it's so much easier. So make sure that you don't skip this step. When row 1 is complete, finish the row with a chain 1 and lay it down for a minute. Grab stitch markers and starting with stitch number 1 on the opposite side of the chain 1 that we just made, count to 12. And then place a stitch marker around the post of this stitch. This will mark the center of the first diamond. Then continue counting from stitch 12 to stitch 32 and place a marker around the post marking stitch number 32. And finally, count to stitch number 52 and mark this stitch around its post. These 3 stitch markers are evenly spaced out now with 20 stitches in between. And the marked stitches will be worked into later on and become the center point of the diamonds. This is what row number 1 looks like now that we added the stitch markers. And you can imagine that each stitch marker represents the center of the diamond. So whenever we start to add the diamonds, the points are going to meet in the middle at the stitch marker in each of the 3 locations. So that's the setup round for row number 1. Now we're going to continue single crocheting for the next 11 rows. So whenever you get to row 12, single crochet all the way across, and then row 13 we're going to start the diamonds. But you also want to place stitch markers on stitches 12, 32, and 52 just as you did on row 1. But continue that for row 3, 5, and 7. So then you'll have 4 rows with stitch markers on them. And that's so that we can stagger those diamonds. But whenever you get to row number 13, I will show you what to do next. After 12 rows, this is what your work should look like. And you can see that since we left off last, I did add stitch markers to rows 3, 5, and 7. And I did so in the 3 different stitches. Now we have our setup for the diamonds complete, and now we're going to be working the section 1 diamonds on rows 13 through 20. So we left off row number 12 was this one that's a wrong side row. So now we've worked our way back to the front side, and you can see that by our stitch markers. And you want to make sure that you went ahead and added a chain 1 and turned your work to the right side. And now we're ready to get started with the special stitches so that we can complete those diamonds. So first off, we're just going to make a simple single crochet into that very first stitch, like so. And then our second stitch is going to be a front post stitch. So we want to make the diamond texture all the way across this diagonal. So we want to take our crochet hook all the way from the top of row number 13 all the way to the bottom and work into this stitch marker, which is on row 1. We're going to be working these like treble crochets, but rather than wrapping the yarn around just once, we're going to wrap it around 11 times. So we start with 1 loop on our hook after we have this single crochet, and then we're going to wrap around 11 more times. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and there's 11 wraps of yarn there. So you'll see we have a lot of yarn there left on our hook, and it's going to be 12 total loops. And now I'm just going to pinch this yarn behind the crochet hook after we have our 11. I'm going to pinch it with my 2 fingers, and I'm going to release the yarn in my other hand because I need it for this next part. So like I said, we're going to be working the diamonds in the diagonal, so we have to work from row 13 all the way down to row number 1. So I'm going to take my crochet hook, and then I'm going to work into this stitch marker. And you can see that there's 2 gaps on either side of where our stitch marker is actually inserted. We're going to work around that same stitch that our stitch marker is in. So we're going to take our crochet hook and go into that first gap, the right side gap, and then we're going to insert it into the back, and then we come out through the left side of that stitch. And you can see that we pulled up that front post, and now we can work our front post stitch. Now I'm gonna wrap the yarn around that crochet hook, and we're gonna bring the yarn through the back side of that front post, like so. And we have that loop there. So now we're gonna wrap the yarn around our crochet hook, and we're gonna work through 2 loops at a time. So I have the yarn wrapped around, I'm gonna work through 1 loop, and then 2 loops. Wrap the yarn around, work through 1 loop, and then that 2nd loop as well. So we're just going to continue this motion all the way up until we get to the top of row number 13 again. So as the loops get shorter on our crochet hook, you'll see that this stitch gets longer. So continue wrapping and then bring it through the next 2 loops, wrap around, next 2, wrap around, next 2, wrap around. Then you're going to get to here where you only have 2 loops left, and you wrap the yarn around the crochet hook, and then you bring it through those 2 loops. And we have now closed this stitch. And this is what your work should look like so far. It is a little bit floppy up here, but you will see that you created that diagonal, so that's the right side of that diamond. So now what we do, because this stitch counts as 1 stitch, we are actually going to skip. If I can get this so I can show you. So this was the first stitch that we single crocheted. And then this would be the 2nd stitch that we'd single crochet into. But since this one counts as a stitch, we skip the 2nd one. So we skip this one, and then we work a single crochet into that next, oh, I got the yarn backwards. So we are skipping one, inserting our hook into the 3rd stitch technically, and we're just gonna make a regular old single crochet. And that's gonna close up that stitch and secure it a little bit better. And now you can see we have our first single crochet, we have that front post stitch, that's the top of it, and then we have the single crochet that we just crocheted. Now we want to work 18 more single crochets before we get to that next stitch. Okay, so this is what our work looks like. So we have 1 single crochet here, we have our first front post stitch right here, and then we have 19 total single crochets in between. So now we've made it to the middle. Let me kind of show you. Now we've made it to the middle of these stitch markers, and this is where the next point of the diamond is going to be. And so our legs of the diamonds are going to work this way, or both directions. So we're going to be using the same stitch, but instead of just 1, we're going to be adding 2. So this stitch is called the front post 2 together. And that's because we want only 1 stitch here at the top. We don't want to be adding extra stitches because our fabric would just grow if we did that. We start in a similar manner. So we have the 1 loop already on our hook, and we wrap the yarn around 11 times, just like we did at the start. That's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and there's 11 wraps of yarn. And again, I like to pinch it here so that I don't lose it. Drop the yarn. And now we want to work into, since we're making the leg of this diamond here, we want to work into the same stitch of stitch number 1 on row number 1. So we're going to be working the opposite side now. And what I like to do is flip this upside down just so that it makes it a little bit easier. So now our row 1 is at the top, and stitch marker number 1 is right here as well. So we take our crochet hook, and just as we did for that first front post stitch, we take our crochet hook from the right side of that stitch, then we're going to take it through to the left side, bring that post up through the stitch, and then we can start that front post stitch again. So while it's like this, we wrap the yarn around, bring the yarn through the back of that front post, pulling it up. Now we have that loop on our hook. Now we're going to wrap the yarn around, and we're still going to bring it through 2 loops at a time. Bring it through the next 2. Bring it through the next 2. And again, this is just the exact same. Oh, if I can get this one. Sometimes it gets stuck. But this is the exact same as what we were doing for the first one. It's just whenever you get to the end of this stitch is what gets a little bit different. So keep bringing it through 2 loops. I'm going to scoot it up. 2 loops, 2 loops, 2 loops. So now you want, rather than yarning over and bringing it through those last 2, you're going to keep those 2 stitches or those 2 loops on your crochet hook. And as I was describing before, if you close this off, you're just going to get another one of these stitches, and then you'd have to start adding another one. But since we want only 1 stitch here at the top, we leave 2 loops on our hook, and then we're going to go through the exact same steps. We're going to wrap the yarn around the hook 11 times. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. But now we just have those 2 extra loops on our hook, and I'll show you what to do whenever we get there. But first, I pinched a yarn. We have all that yarn here on our hook, just waiting to be worked up. And since we have the right side, like that right leg done, we're going to be adding that left leg. So now you can see why we have those stitch markers. We're going to be working into row 1, but we're going to go to that next stitch marker. So we've already worked row 1, or stitch 12. Now we're going to work stitch 32. So I'm going to take my yarn, or my crochet hook with the yarn. I go through the right side of the stitch, bring it over to the left side, pulling that stitch up to the front. I'm going to tension my yarn, yarn over, and bring that yarn through that stitch, like so. And now we're going to, again, work through 2 loops at a time. So yarn over, work through 2 loops. Yarn over, work through 2. Just continue this all the way up. So now we have 3 loops here left on our crochet hook. So rather than going through 2 at a time, this would be the top, since we went through 11 and we had the 2 extra stitches on our crochet hook. We leave it like this. We leave that loop here, and this is where the 2 together comes in. We're combining these 2 stitches together. So you want to keep those 3 loops, yarn over, and then bring through all 3 of those, and that brings those 2 stitches here into the 1 stitch. And maybe I can show you this. So now, since we have the 2 stitches, this is the top of those 2 stitches, but we only have the 1. And now, just as we did for the other one, or for the first front post stitch, you can see the next stitch to work into would be this one, but we skip it because this front post 2 together counts as 1 stitch. So we skip this one, and then we start working into that next one. So this is a skipped one, and then this will be the next one that we work into. Now you're going to continue the exact same process. You're going to single crochet 19 more stitches. Whenever you get to the end of the 19 stitches, you're going to front post 2 together, which is exactly the stitch that I just showed you how to do. And then you single crochet 19 more stitches, work the last front post stitch. So you're only going to be doing a half or 1 leg. It's just going to be going to the opposite diagonal as what we used on the first one. And then you're going to skip a stitch and finish off by single crocheting into that last stitch. And then you chain 1 and single crochet across row number 14, because you want to work your way back to the front side of the fabric so that we can continue on to row number 15. This is what your fabric should look like now after completing row number 14. So we've made it back to the right side of the fabric and we're ready to continue the diamond stitches. So we're gonna start by single crocheting into the first stitch. We'll work a front post stitch into our next stitch marker, and then we'll continue single crocheting 19 stitches across, and then we'll make a front post 2 together stitch and work it into the next 2 stitch markers. And then we're just going to continue that pattern until we have completed row number 15. And then we're going to single crochet all the way across and make our way back to the front side of the fabric. And we're going to continue that 2 more times until our last 2 stitch markers have been worked. Section 1 is complete, and we crocheted the bottom of the first set of diamonds. So this is what your work looks like now. And don't worry if your front post stitches are a little bit loose. We will block this, and that's going to pull those a little bit tighter. So don't worry too much if they're a little bit loose right now. We will get to that. But for now, we can go ahead and move on to section number 2. And section number 2 is going to be working the same front post stitches that we worked in section 1, except we're going to be working the mirror image of these front post stitches. I went ahead and added row number 21, which is the start of section number 2. And you want to put your stitch markers in 4 different stitches on stitch 2, which aligns with the edge of our first front post stitch. Row 22, which aligns with these, stitch 42, and then stitch 62. And you will notice that I did take the stitch markers out already here. You can keep them there if you want, but I need to steal the stitch markers for this next section. So section 2 does start just as section 1 did. We need a setup round of single crochet rows so that we can start working those front post 2 together stitches. So rows 21 through rows 30 are all just single crocheted, but go ahead and add stitch markers on stitches 2, 22, 42, and 62 on rows 21, 23, and 25. That'll give you 3 sets of stitch markers, like 3 rows with stitch markers. Then our 4th row is actually going to be row 19 because we're going to work into our front post stitches of this row as we continue section 2. But go ahead and work all those single crochet rows for the setup rounds of section number 2. Section 2 is now growing. We have our setup rows of single crochet all made for section 2. So now we're ready to get started on row number 31, which is a right side row. That's where we're going to be adding front post 2 together stitches so that we can complete the tops of the diamonds. So I'm going to show you this section and this row because it works the exact same way, but it's a little bit different because we're going to be working into the previous front post stitches from our last row of section 1. So this is row 31, and make sure that you chain 1 and you turn your work to the right side, which I've already done. We're going to start this row off by single crocheting 11 stitches. So that's 1, 2, and whenever we add those 11 single crochets, that's going to put us in the center of the peak of the bottom diamond, which is exactly what you want because you want the top of your diamond to be in alignment with the bottom peak. So now we're ready to add a front post 2 together stitch. So we're going to work this the exact same way as we did section 1. So wrap the yarn around 11 times. That's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and there's 11 wraps. And on the front post 2 together stitches, I find it easier to rotate our wall hanging. I'm going to rotate this way. So now you can see our first stitch that we want to work into is this front post stitch. So I'm just going to take my hook. I'm just going to place it underneath. You don't have to go into a stitch or anything. I'm just going to go underneath that front post stitch that we made in section 1, And then I'm going to wrap the yarn around my hook and then bring it through the back side of that front post stitch. You can see that it kind of shifted a little bit further. I'm just going to move that yarn to where it comes to the top of the stitch like this. And then I'm going to pull that yarn together, which I need to bring it a little bit closer, sorry. You just want to tighten it around that front post stitch, like so. So now we have connected our yarn to the front post stitch, now we can yarn over and we start that stitch by bringing that yarn over through 2 loops at a time and working our way back to the top of the stitch. So like I said, this is the exact same stitch from section number 1. We're just doing, the placement is just a little bit different. Okay, and since this is a front post 2 together stitch, we leave those 2 loops on our crochet hook. So now we're back to the top. I rotated it back. So you have the 2 loops, so now you just wrap the yarn around 11 more times. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and there's 11 wraps. Now this one looks a little bit different because it has the 2 legs, because this one was a front post 2 together stitch. So all you're going to do is bring your crochet hook and you can pull it up, and you're just going to put your crochet hook behind that peak right there. So you don't have to go into a stitch or anything, you just put your crochet hook behind that peak where these 2 stitches come together, or these 2 legs come together, and then you're going to take your yarn over your hook and then bring your hook through to the front, and then you're going to tighten that yarn up like so, and you can reposition to where the yarn over is at the top of the stitch just in case it shifts a little bit further down, but tighten up that yarn, and then we begin the last leg of our front post 2 together stitch. So yarn over and then start bringing the yarn through those 2 loops. Then whenever you get to the top, since it's a front post 2 together stitch, you still have 3 loops here on our hook. On that last yarn over, you bring through all 3 of those loops. And now we have a front post 2 together stitch. And we have completed the first diamond. So we continue in the same manner where you look at your piece. We're going to skip that stitch, that next stitch right here. We skip it since the front post 2 together stitch counts as 1. And we're going to single crochet into the next stitch. And you want to now complete 18 more, so a total of 19 single crochet stitches until you're in the center of the next one. And that's how you complete row number 31. You're just going to continue this all the way over. So once you have your 19 stitches, single crochet, you make a front post 2 together and you go around the peak on both sides. Then you're going to end with another front post 2 together, and then you go through those 2 peaks like so. And that's how you complete section number 2. You're just going to continue in the same manner as we just did for that front post 2 together stitch. So after row number 31, you want to add a row of just plain single crochet on the back side to work your way back over to the right side, and then continue with the front post 2 together stitches. And you'll repeat those 2 rows 3 more times so that you will have a total of 4 diamonds again. Also, you want to be working into the next stitch marker each time. This is section 2 completed, and we do have full sets of diamonds now. So we're going to end the wall hanging with one more section, section number 3, and that's just a repeat of what we did for section number 1. So we're going to do the setup round for the diamonds. So you want to single crochet across the rows for rows 39 through 48. And on rows 39, 41, and 43, we want to put the stitch markers on stitches 12, 32, and 52, and then you just continue to single crochet, and whenever you get to row number 49, you're back on a right side row. You're going to single crochet into that first stitch, and you're going to start over and do the front post stitches and then the front post 2 together stitches, just as we did for section number 1. Before we go any further with assembling the wall hanging, we must first block the piece. But, and this is very important, leave your yarn attached to the ball. Do not cut it yet. And you'll see that I do have some strings, and that is for this reason, because we have one last little bit to crochet. Maybe I should take a second to talk about blocking in case there is someone that is unfamiliar with it, but basically you soak your piece in water for about 10 to 15 minutes, then you wring out all the water that you can, and you throw it out onto blocking mats, and then you use pins to pin it into place into the exact dimensions that the pattern calls for. So this will stretch out your fabric, but it's really going to straighten up those stitches, and your diamonds will look 100% better. After the piece is all dry, we can start assembling the wall hanging. The first step is to crochet the top of the wall hanging to a dowel rod, because at the end, this is how we'll be able to hang it to the wall. So you make single crochets just like normal, but you hold the dowel rod in between your hook and the yarn whenever you make a yarn over. And if you need any more help with this, I'll link a separate video that slows down this process. Next is adding fringe to the bottom of the wall hanging. First you'll need to cut about 252 pieces of yarn, each measuring 50 inches long. And we'll start on row number 1, stitch number 1. And you insert your hook into the first stitch from the right side to the wrong side, then fold 2 pieces of yarn in half and put the loop around the hook. Then you'll pull those loops through the stitch, and then pull those strands of yarn through the loops to secure the fringe to the wall hanging. Repeat the same thing for every other stitch on row number 1. When you're done adding fringe on row 1, move to row 3. Add the pieces of fringe to every other stitch, starting with stitch number 2 this time. And these pieces of fringe should fall into the gap from row number 1 below. By adding fringe to row number 1 and 3 in this manner, this will give the wall hanging its fullness. Finally, add fringe to row 12. This time, add pieces to every single stitch across. And when you get to the peaks, split the yarn in half and tuck it behind the front post stitches. Then you can fill the gap at the bottom by adding a piece of fringe to the peak. You can kind of play around with this part just a little bit to make it look how you want. We are just about ready to assemble the entire shelf to our wall hanging, but first we need to add the straps to the dowel rod in order to do so. So I'm going to start with 16 total pieces of yarn, each measuring about 70 inches. And I have already folded this one in half, and I have the loop at the top. I'm going to take that loop and go behind the dowel rod. And I'm going to bring the 2 yarn strands through the loop. And then pull it tight to the dowel rod. And this is our first piece of our strap that we have completed. I'm going to take the next one. And rather than going behind, I'm going to take this loop in front of the dowel rod and then bring that loop down behind so that it now looks like this. And then I'll take the yarn just like I did the first one, and just like we added the fringe to the bottom as well. You just bring those yarn strands through and pull that loop tight onto our dowel rod. So now you can see that the first one, that piece of yarn, or the loop rather, is behind and you don't see it. Whereas on the second strand, you do see that line of the yarn coming from where we attach that loop. And we want to alternate every other one on each side. We're going to take the yarn behind that dowel rod and then bring it up and over, bring the yarn strands through, pull it tight, and now we have 3 attached to our dowel rod. And you're just going to continue this manner all the way across for your 8 pieces of yarn. This is what your piece should look like after you have added the yarn for the straps. You do want every other piece alternating with a dash. The final step of adding the straps is to tie a knot at the bottom of our strap so that we can balance the piece of wood in between to make that shelf. So I'm going to show you on this side of my wall hanging, and you're going to need a marker and a tape measure. We're going to start by measuring the first strand of yarn, holding the measuring tape at the very top of the strand, which is just below that dowel rod. And we are going to take that strand, we're going to measure it down to 26 inches, which I'm going to go out of frame here, but I'll show you. So we're here at 26 inches. So I'm going to pinch it here, take my marker. I'm just going to mark a line here, have a dot to mark 26 inches, like so. So these 2 strands go together, it's a pair, and we already measured 26 inches on this one. So now we're going to take the 3rd strand in line, which is going to be the second pair, which is different, the way that we tied them on here. So I'm going to take the 3rd strand and we're going to measure an inch further. So we're going to measure it down to 27 inches. After the yarn is marked, we're going to take the 1st pair of strands, the 3rd pair of strands, 5th pair, and the 7th pair. And you can just tell by looking visually, these are the strands that do not have the yarn in the front. So these are going to become the front of the strap whenever we tie the knot at the bottom. And it's kind of hard to show because it's off camera, but I'm basically just combing the yarn down, and whenever I come across the yarn that's twisted or overlapped, I just try to comb through that and make it as straight as possible so that all of the yarn is not twisted. So I'm going to do this for the front side of the yarn, and I'm going to pull it taut just to make sure that it's good. Okay, then I'll lay it across, and then I'm going to do the exact same thing for the back side for these strands of yarn. Just combing with my fingers, trying to make it as straight as possible. Okay, and so as I'm combing, I'm going to take my fingers all the way down until I find that dot, which measures that 27 inches. So that's the back side. I'm going to pinch it like so with my index and middle finger. Just going to pinch it, and this yarn is going to be pretty straight. And since I just did the same thing with this yarn, I'm going to try to straighten it up so that I get it even. And I'm just pinching down, trying to find where the dot is and trying to keep the yarn as straight as possible. Okay, so I found the dot as well, and this is the front strap, right? So we have the front and then the back. Front in our left hand, right in our back. And I am going to overlap the front strap over the back strap, and we're going to line up the dots together. Okay, I think I've pretty much got it. So once those are overlapped, we're going to pinch where they're lined up, where the dot is. I'm just going to pinch it here. I'm just going to make a simple knot, but we want to keep the dot at the top. So I just
wrap it around my fingers. And bring these strands of yarn through. But you can see that I'm still pinching it where the dot is, and we're just going to be careful to line the top. Oops, it's on this side. We're going to be careful to line the top of the knot with our dot. And you can just pull it tight. And then you can either leave your yarn as is, or you can cut to where it's all the same length. The final stage of your wall hanging, before you can add the shelf, you do have to add a piece of yarn that extends from the right side to the left side. And you can do this many ways. I'm just going to tie a knot to the right side, but also feel free to braid your yarn. I did have testers do that. And you can use one strand, multiple strands, but you do want to do this on both sides of your wall hanging.